Hello there, sword friends. I wanted to talk to you about a topic about bias. Now, whenever you're reviewing a sword, each of us will bring different opinions as to why a sword is better than another sword. Maybe it's just the aesthetics of it. Maybe someone finds it more beautiful than another. Maybe it's the functionality, how it operates, and certain folks will gravitate to certain types of swords, whether they're more dynamic, whether they're more durable, whether they're more cutty. Some folks are more interested in specific cultures. So we have guys that only study one specific culture's swords. Obviously, we have Nihonto collectors. We have folks that study just British swords. I know lots of friends that collect Indian swords, for example. Um, my area of study is the historical aspects of swords. And so I wanted to discuss my bias specifically, and I wanted to kind of quantify it so that it will help everyone when I'm looking at swords, because I don't always divulge that, and it'll color all of my reviews to some degree. And if I am a little bit more upfront about that, it'll help explain why I might look at a sword and I might either poo-poo it or the opposite. I might raise it up and say, "Oh wow, this is a great sword." And one of my good friends, whose opinion I might respect tremendously, may have a completely different interpretation of the sword. And so when you're looking at my reviews, you can use that to better see what lens I am using to review swords. So to me, I am an armchair historian, is what I like to describe. I'm using swords to help learn about history, and the history of swords and the development of swords and sword design is really what interests me. So the historical accuracy of the sword, or the historicity of the sword, is what's very important to me when I'm looking at a sword. That's not the only thing that's important, but that rates very highly. And I'm going to show you some comparison about. We're going to compare a couple of different swords and try and show you what I think about when looking at them. So if you want to study the history of sword design and try and figure out what's the most historically accurate sword, obviously nothing will beat an antique. An antique sword is an actual sword that was used in the historical period, and if you're trying to learn about actual antique or actual swords and the people that used them and the way that they were designed, you're going to learn the most information if you study the originals. You will never, ever be able to learn as much from a reproduction as you will by studying an original antique sword. That said, you cannot do everything with an antique sword that you can with a reproduction sword. So there are times when having a reproduction of an original antique sword is useful, because you can put the reproduction through paces and you can do things with them that I would never want to do with an antique sword. So I think that there is still a place for both in our better learning and better understanding of what swords were in the past. Oftentimes, antiques have degraded and they are no longer in the original state, so they don't reflect what swords looked like and how they presented themselves in the culture they were in. And again, you can't take them and just put them through their paces. You can't necessarily show what they could do dynamically, nor can you bring them to failure, or you shouldn't. I don't want to see everyone going and smashing these beautiful antiques, bringing them to failure testing. Don't send them to Matthew Jensen. So, there is nothing that is going to score higher in historicity than an antique sword. Now, let's really quickly look at a bunch of different medieval swords from different makers and see how they fall on my grading system for historical accuracy. This is the next level. This is a sword made by Eric Estland, and it's a type of messer. It's called the Ljubljana messer. It's not a German messer. This is a Slovenian messer. And he has taken the time to reproduce not just a general messer, but a very specific sword. So he built this on the designs that he studied an original find. So rather than being representative of just, any old general shapes, that he wanted to get something that was vaguely in the dimensions of a sword from the period, he studied the original finds that were dug up and he recreated it as faithfully as possible. Now, obviously, there's still degrees to exactly how historically accurate you can be. You can talk about what materials you use. You can talk about the steel that's being used. Um, I have mentioned in other videos that while there are plenty of sword collectors that get very interested, for instance, in the metallurgy, the method of production, the some of the materials used, I spend less time on that. So, for instance, if this was done using one type of a billet or one type of a stock of steel, that will be perhaps less of interest to me, although you certainly could look at that and grade him on how closely of a job did he do, or how close to traditional methods did he do in his historical production. To me, whether he used a power hammer or whether he just used his own hammer doesn't matter to me personally as much, because the end result is, to me, almost indistinguishable. If this sword was taken and dropped in the ground and buried for 10, 15 years and then exhumed, it would be virtually indistinguishable to me from one of the original historical artifacts. And I've been studying these swords for a long time. His attention to detail in reproducing it is tremendous. There's almost no signs other than the maker's mark on here that this is anything other than the original that was produced. He has taken such great care and attention into reproducing it. This is an S tier level of historical accuracy. We will come back to if we will come back later as to if you always have to go to a custom smith to achieve that. But this beautiful example from Eric Estlin is an example of the highest level of degree that you can get by trying to reproduce an original antique, a specific original antique. So next, this is an Albion, and it should surprise no one that this score is very high. So Albions have a reputation for being very great swords to own as far as production swords are concerned, and I score them just below the level of S tier in general. As a quick aside, I'm not going to apply my grading systems to whole manufacturers. If we take a quick break, some of my buddies, Kane Shen, Alien Tude, Matthew Jensen, recently had a video series where they listed various manufacturers and they gave them scores as to who they felt were high quality manufacturers that you could purchase from. I think those series are great, and I recommend you check them out because they were much more detailed and gave a lot more information about manufacturers than I myself could provide, and I don't plan to do a list like that anytime soon. That said, this system that I'm describing is intended to look at individual swords, and as I'll discuss towards the end of the video, I don't think it should be applied to manufacturers blanketly, because individual swords should be able to have different levels of historicity. So for this specific example, this Albion Castellan, what we have here is a sword that is very, very highly accurate and representative of swords of the period. This is a Type 15A sword. Its grip is very consistent with what you find in the period. The type of guard, the type of pommel, the type Oakshot 15A blade, all are things that we could find of swords in the period. The steel is modern. It's a monosteel blade. But the shape, the geometry, the designs from Peter Johnson. If I just drop this in with the museum, if I put this in a museum, we'd say, oh, it looks like it's fresh, but otherwise it would slot into the group nicely. That said, this is not imitative of any one specific sword. Instead, this is an approximation based on a whole group of swords. So he may have studied 2 or 3 dozen swords and then come up, he borrowed the cross from one, the pommel from another, the blade from another, used the grip that he saw on a variety of different swords and put them all together and came up with this one sword. So this is still very highly accurate, and I can learn a tremendous amount about swords from the 15th century by picking up the sword and studying it. And so it gets a very high A rating, but at the same time, this is not representative of an original antique. This is just meant to be of a sword type that you could probably find anywhere in that time period. A score, not an S score, but an A score. Moving down the line, this is a Balor Arms longsword, an Italian longsword, and it shares elements from a variety of different original swords, but I don't think I've ever seen these specific combinations together on an original. The grip wrap is acceptable. The crossguard is again similar to several that I've seen in person. The peen, the way it's done, is decidedly modern. It won't be mistaken for an original. The pommel again has features that show that it was done in a modern fashion rather than an antique fashion. The blade is quite nice, but has aspects of it that belie the fact that it was done in China rather than on in an antique fashion. There's some small nuances to its geometry, the way that it handles the amount of distal taper in it, the type of profile. It's imitative of Type 18 B style blades, but it's not exactly like you'd find on an original. Although it's still quite handy and quite nice. So I can still learn a lot about longswords if I pick this one up, yet at the same time, this is starting to drift away a little bit from the actual medieval designs. There's a lot that's going on that's good with this sword, but there are definitely things that could be improved upon if the goal is historical accuracy. So this is the type of sword that I'm starting to give a B score to. Let's see if I ruffle any feathers with this one. We have here an A-trim sword, a very pricey sword, and it's a high quality sword. Yet this sword is scoring less than the Balor Arms sword. And why is that? Well, we have several things that are going on with it. We have a very atypical style of peen block going on. We have a pommel that is not like you would find in the medieval period. You have a crossguard that is similarly machined in a fashion that you wouldn't really see in the medieval style period. Both the pommel and the cross show indications of modern style manufacture. And the entire thing is married to this blade, and the blade is beautifully done. I really love the blade and the way that this handles. However, the blade is married to this type of high medieval style hilt, which is a combination that you really don't see in the archaeological record. This is a bit of a conjectural piece that he produced, and I'd probably like to discuss his thoughts in doing that, because you have something that you'd see perhaps in Eastern Europe as a saber attached to a kind of falchion style hilt, which is again a combination that maybe we see in art, but we don't really see happening in the historical record. So as a result, this is drifting further outside of the realm of what you can learn about in history and entering the realm of kind of conjecture. So as a result of that, this has lost a lot of points from the historical accurate standpoint, even though the blade itself is very, very well executed. So this is only scoring a C from me. Hopefully, just like you, I love The Lord of the Rings, and Peter Jackson came up with a wonderful world. And the folks at Weta helped design and have the swords executed by famed bladesmith Peter Lyons. And so this example here, the longsword of the Witch King of Angmar, is spectacular and really one of my favorite fantasy designs. It is really a cool and awesome sword. And even though it very clearly takes its inspiration from actual medieval longswords, so it is definitely inspired by real swords, which is why it's such a successful fantasy design. At this point, we have really departed from actual medieval swords, and there's very little we can learn about historical swords from this. There are some things we can still learn about balance, perhaps a little bit. We can learn about how crosses work, how ricassos work. We can learn about fullering and edges. So there's very sparing amounts that we can learn from it. But teaching us about the people, the way swords are manufactured, the way swords are used, the way that this was respected in the culture of the time, almost none of those elements are able to be gleaned from this because at this point it is a piece of fantasy. This gets a D score. F. Now, it might seem on the surface that in order to score high for historicity, you have to pay a lot of money. I mean, not everyone can pick up an Albion. But that's not always the case. You don't have to be a beautiful sword or an expensive sword in order to score high in historicity. Now, it's true that in order to do the job right, that requires time and research, and usually that translates into more cost. However, this is an example of a messer from Landsnecht Emporium, and this is a very faithfully done messer that is consistent with finds that you can see in actual examples from Germany. It has all sorts of irregularities. It has guards that aren't perfectly straight. It has hammer marks on it. It has little bits of gap between the tang and the slots on here. The nagel isn't pushed in all the way. And these are all things we can find on originals. I can learn a lot about how messers were produced by picking up and using this sword. It all depends on what the selection is when the maker is picking the individual blade that they choose. So if you want to pick up an imperial sword, you're going to be paying imperial prices in order to get that reproduced. If you want to pick up a humble sword, yeah, it's might be a little bit more expensive than a mass manufactured sword due to economy of scale, but that doesn't mean that it's going to be the most expensive item in the world. So again, my interest is how close they were able to get to what the originals were. That doesn't mean that the sword has to handle great. There are many historical swords that handled really badly, and I'm okay with that because I'm going to be learning something when I handle the sword. That's what's exciting to me. Now, for completeness sake, let's go and give some of the other swords I've already reviewed a score and see how they compare. Now to be fair, I usually am looking at swords that are very historically accurate, so I expect that most of these should score pretty high. Let's go all the way back to the beginning of my videos. Very first one was the LK Chen Niu Wei Dao. That is very faithfully made Niu Wei Dao. Most of LK Chen's stuff gets a pretty high score. I'm going to give that one an A minus. I like how that one came out. And again, each individual manufacturer has the ability to have a variety of different scores. So LK Chen may make spectacular Chinese scores, but may get lower scores for their European line, etc., etc. A Japanese manufacturer may make spectacular Japanese swords, but may not do as good Chinese swords. So I will grade each individual sword on its own merits rather than just give a blanket score across the entire manufacturer, although certain manufacturers obviously tend to be better than others. Next up, the LK Chen Yanling Dao. That one, I took issue with some of how the grip was produced. I'm gonna give that one a B plus. It's very well made, but there are significant liberties that it has compared to some of the antique originals. It was specifically made using specifications off of an example from Peter Decker's collection, but there were deviations that are large enough that will change its handling characteristics. I love the sword. The sword is great, but I'm going to give it a B based on its historical accuracy, especially based on how the hilt was made. Next up was the Imperial Guard Chengdao. There aren't very many Chengdao on the market. I don't know enough about the Chengdao example that LK Chen based his on. The guard, the Hosho, is very good from what I can see. The wrap, I think, is probably a later addition, but on the whole, it's pretty good and a pretty nicely put together sword. I'm going to give that one an A minus. The Kingston Arms Type 14 arming sword, that is a pretty solid B. It's a nice sword, but the secondary edge on it makes it pretty rough. If I included the scabbard, it probably drops to like a B minus. It's a really fun and enjoyable sword to work with, but it has some issues. The LK Chen Scarlet Sunrise. The Scarlet Sunrise has some great fittings attached to it. The blade type is a little conjectural because he doesn't have very many blades that survive from that period. So that's going to keep it from an A. I'm going to give that a B plus. The Albion Clontarf. The Albion I already previously said gets an A, so I will continue to give that one an A. The Hanwei that it was compared with, the Hanwei 9th century Viking sword, it had some issues both with the grip wrap and with the cross section. It was a diamond cross section instead of a lenticular cross section. So that's a pretty good example of a B compared to an A sword. So they're similar in their proportions, but they handle quite a bit differently, and the details are what distinguish them and keep them apart. The VA ring pommel Irish sword, that's a really nice and lovely sword. It deviates a bit from both the blade type and the fittings are okay. I rather like the fittings and the grip and the leather work on it. How to score that one? There are some things on it that are very well done, and some things on it that deviate quite a bit historically. I'm probably going to give that one a B plus. It's on the surface, it looks like it would be very, very historically accurate, but there are some things on there that divert quite a bit from the historical find. So, for instance, that type of blade is usually not married to that type of hilt construction. It's cool. It's a really neat sword. I really like it a lot, but I don't think it's particularly historically accurate. The LK Chen Tong Zhang Zhama Dao. The Tang period Zhama Dao, there's only really 2 examples of them surviving. LK Chen is trying to reproduce them as faithfully as possible. He's really the only one who's done so. As far as the restoration is concerned, from what I can see, he's done an excellent job. I'll give it an A minus. There was the example of the Ronin katana and I compared it to an antique tachi, and I pointed out in that video exactly how closely they matched up next to each other. I'll give the Ronin katana an A. It's not a very, very high, expensive katana, and I'm giving it very high marks given that it's very low price point. You can certainly get more high quality katana if you want to spend better money on it, but given how low the quality is, the fact that you have such well done Ito, Fujikashira, Suba, Habaki, even Real Hamon on there at that price point is remarkable. So it gets an A, and it's a testament to how robust the reproduction Japanese market is. Next up, we have the Passeri Handicraft Kulich. That is that gets an A. It's a really well done Kulich. Passeri knows his trade really well, and he's doing it in the authentic style. Let's see if we have any other ones. The Elkichen Tong Hengdao. That one will get an A minus. It's pretty faithful to originals. I think that he could improve the casting on some of the fittings a little bit, but it would be very hard. Like, it's bordering on being indistinguishable from some of the original designs if you just buried it. The LK Chen US M 1860 light cavalry saber. This one is probably an S, maybe an S minus. I could probably give it tiny little faults if I wanted to, but it's one of those things where you'd have to start disassembling it in order to be able to tell it. This one is good enough that if we aged it, it would start to fool me from some of the antique originals. This is a very faithfully reproduced pattern of sword because it's based on an original that he probably purchased and had there in the factory, and he's able to reproduce it almost flawlessly. Excellent job on the 1860 cavalry saber. The light cavalry, the 1796 British light cavalry saber, I'd say that's probably more like a B plus. There's enough different from it that I think that he could probably tighten up the pattern a little bit. It's a great handling sword, but there are enough differences from it that you would be able to still pull it out of a lineup and tell that that is a reproduction rather than an original. We also have, let's see, the Handao. Both the Royal Arsenal and the Long Handao are excellently done. I would say both of them get easily an A score. The Saber of Charlemagne done by Hanwei also gets an A. Even though it's based on an original, there are enough deviations from the original that it keeps it from getting an S grade. It's a very well done sword and great for its price, but I wouldn't give it an S score. The Albion Sovereign also gets an A. It's an Albion and it's very well executed. The Dadao by LK Chen, I might actually give an S score. It's so well done that it's probably indistinguishable from an actual Dadao from the Republic period. Again, it's one of those ones where if you dropped it in the ground and dug it up, I wouldn't be able to tell that it's a modern-made Dadao at all. The Snow Peak. And the Snow Peak I will give an A. The Snow Peak Jian from LK Chen I'll give an A. And the Longchuan Jian, ooh, that's really good. I probably give that an A plus. It's really intricately done and very well executed. It looks a lot like a bunch of the antiques that it's representing. Very good swords. Similarly, let's see what else we have here. Have an antique. Does an antique count? That's an S score. The Balor Arms, the Balor Arms Knight Templar arming sword probably gets a B plus. It's getting close to Albion level. It's not quite at Albion level, but it's quite good. Similarly, the Munich Town Guard sword, I would say that that's a B. It's quite nice, but it's not quite at the level of fidelity that you'd expect from something like an Albion. I mentioned previously that Landsknecht Emporium's Messer I gave an A score, even though it's not as refined as you'd expect to see on an Albion. The ability for them to reproduce what Messers looked like in the period is top notch. Excellent blade. Albion Kern, A. Elkechen Shemshir, also A. I received three swords from Eric Usland. I haven't rated them all. He definitely gets an S score for the Ljubljana Messer. The other two are not based on originals, so I would probably give them more like an A plus score because, again, just like an Albion, they are conjectural swords that could be slotted in among actual historical examples, but they're not based on specific finds. They're very good swords. And the last one I'll look at is the Elkechen Majestic Wang Taichi Yaodao, which I haven't reviewed formally, but my initial impressions are it is quite good. It's based on an original. It falls a little short of getting an S score. I don't think I'd want to give it an S minus. I'm going to give it an A plus because it's very clearly recognizable. It's spec'd very closely to the original Imperial sword. Given that it's an Imperial sword, you'd probably have to pay a king's ransom in order to perfectly one-to-one replicate it, but this is very, very close for a mass-manufactured sword. I'm going to give it an A+. So I hope this little tour helps explain a little bit of what I'm looking at when I'm reviewing these swords. So in the future, I might give a sword a grade and say, hey, this sword is very faithfully historically accurate. I'm going to give it an A for historicity. That does not mean the sword is functional. That does not mean the sword is beautiful. It may be ugly. It may not function well, or it may function awesome. It's just something that I am using to help explain why I may like the sword particularly well, or I may not be attracted to the sword. So if I say, the sword doesn't suit me particularly well, and you're looking at the sword and drooling over it, that may just happen to be why one sword collector happens to have an interest in a sword and a different sword collector may not have an interest in it at all. This is just another way of reviewing a sword's features, and it happens to be a bias that I have because I happen to be a student of sword history. So I wanted to share that with everyone. I hope you found that interesting. Do you find this interesting? Do you like studying sword history? Let me know. Let me know if there's anything that didn't make sense or if there's anything I missed. Until we see you guys next time, take care.